Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shannon Koval, and I'm the coordinator for the Trust Ethics Governance Alliance here at the Business School at the University of Queensland. And as always, I'm thrilled to be hosting the Alliance's seminar series today, where we will be exploring misleading and trustworthy environmental communication in the airline industry. And we have the lovely Dr. Mireia Guix with us, who is new to TIGA as well. So welcome. Before we get started, I would like to first do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of UQ, I pay our respects to our ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to the Australian and global society. Now, this seminar is proudly hosted by the UQ Trust Ethics Governance Alliance, which is really just a community of researchers, educators, and professionals who really have a passion for building trustworthy organizations, creating ethical change, and developing robust governance in organizations. So if this is your first time joining, welcome. This seminar series really does aim to share and deepen our understanding of research across these three pillars of trust ethics and governance. And we really see it as a vehicle to facilitate research connections and synergies. So if this talk in particular sparks your interest, I really do encourage you to reach out to myself or to Mireia. And as always, you can always jump onto our website and our LinkedIn page, which also features, latest insights, any previous events that we've recorded. We've popped it onto the website as well, including some great discussion and news outlets. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. See, most of you are on mute with your cameras off, which is always great. But if you could just keep your microphone on mute until the end of Mireia's talk, that would be great. And then feel free to turn on your camera and join in on the Q&A. And also feel free to pop in any questions on the chat while she's presenting as well. So I'd like to formally introduce Mireia. So Mireia is a lecturer here in the tourism discipline in the business school. And her research really addresses different aspects of corporate social responsibility management and communication, as well as social and environmental accounting and reporting for the tourism and hospitality industry. She combines qualitative and quantitative content analysis of public communications to explore ethical issues such as carbon offsets, net zero commitments, and modern slavery. And she's worked with several different organizations, including, just to name a few, the United Nations Environmental Program, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Commission, and national tourism government agencies, just to name a few. So I might just hand it over to you, Mireia. Really, really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Shannon, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present here today. So this presentation is based on a research published together with Claudia Uller and Professor Xavier Font from the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. And as consumers, we face an avalanche of environmental claims, and we possibly have all experienced this feeling on whether the product or service we are about to buy is as green as it is advertised to be. So while greenwashing has been around since the early 1980s, it is now becoming a problem for more sustainable consumption choices. Companies are increasingly using environmental claims, and a significant proportion of those claims are either false, misleading, or vague. For example, studies in the European Union found half of the claims are vague and misleading or unfounded. 40% of the claims are unsubstantiated, and similar patterns are found in a recent study from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission from last year, who found that half of the businesses screened made concerning claims about their environmental credentials in the internet. They were vague, unquantified, absolute, or exaggerated claims. So as consumers, we may not be able to verify the accuracy of those claims and environmental credentials. And research has found that we actually need high levels of awareness and specific knowledge to be able to spot greenwashing. So we must trust the impressions that those claims are made on us. And then that may complicate making informed decisions about which products are greener than others. But alternatively, some consumers may be able to suspect greenwashing. And in those instances, when we suspect greenwashing, misleading claims contribute to confusion in the market, undermine consumers' trust on the company, but perhaps even more worryingly, misleading claims contribute to undermine the confidence in the environmental claims in general, and therefore it increased consumer skepticism. This can have a negative effect on the disadvantaged businesses that make genuine claims, but also either if we perceive greenwashing or we don't perceive greenwashing and we are affected by the inability to make informed decisions, basically that hinders a transition to more sustainable consumption choices. And while there are many definitions on greenwashing, greenwashing definitions relate to the idea of giving a false impression or providing misleading information as to the sustainability of products or services. And that implies claims that are unclear or poorly substantiated, for example. So greenwashing has industry-specific traits. To some extent, right, there is agreement on the need of sector-specific guidance. And in particular, in this study, we focused on the context of aviation, given that it has received considerable attention in the media, questioning the credibility of their environmental claims. Aviation indeed accounts to 2.5% of global CO2 emissions, but if we consider non-CO2 emissions climate impacts, that increases to 3.5% of the global warming contribution. And while we are aware of the need to fly less as consumers, actually air traffic in April reached an estimated of 8% of pre-pandemic levels. So whenever we plan our holidays or we go for business, we are confronted with making a decision on whether, when we're buying flight tickets, if we want to offset or not our carbon footprint for a few extra dollars. So usually the opportunity to compensate our estimated share of CO2 emissions for the flight we are purchasing is a very convenient price. Here we see an example from a round trip of Brisbane-Sydney for today, and with a couple of extra dollars in our flight ticket to ease our consciousness about contributing to climate change, it actually sounds like a pretty good deal. So my focus today on the presentation will be on the types of messages we receive as consumers facing that decision when we purchase the flight ticket, whether we want to offset or not our footprint. But before I do that, let's have a bit of an understanding of what we know about carbon offsetting in the airline industry. So carbon offsetting is about compensating greenhouse gas emissions, and it's typically done through the marketplace of carbon credits, where one credit is worth 1 ton of CO2 equivalent reductions. The credit can be used as a commodity within the voluntary carbon market, and credits ideally should be rigorous with a specific criteria, such as additional, not overestimated, or exclusively claimed. But basically, voluntary carbon offsetting is assumed that passes the responsibility of reducing carbon footprint of travel to consumers. And research has found that actually only 10% of air passengers voluntarily offset their flight emissions. So really the uptake of such programs is quite relatively low. Research has also found that there is a lack of information, transparency, clarity, and scientific accuracy of the claims. And because offsetting is a technical term, it is unlikely that mass consumers are able to have a clear understanding of what carbon offsets are and actually its implications for claiming carbon neutrality. So prior research has identified this lack of consumer awareness about the programs and also some credibility issues with those types of programs. And research has also identified framings of offsetting to increase consumer responses, attitudes, and engagement towards increasing this 10% rate of engagement of consumers. So, for example, showcasing co-benefits for individuals in terms of health and biodiversity, or using domestic and certified voluntary carbon programs has been proven to increase the uptake and the willingness to pay for such programs. Also, source credibility through the labels that are used on the programs increases the likelihood of opting in, as well as allowing to choose the initiatives and projects the money you are paying goes to. And more recently, some researchers tested concrete messages versus general and abstract messages, and they found that concrete messages work best for intentions to travel in the near future, while general initiatives increase the intention to purchase these voluntary carbon offsets when flying in the distant future. So researchers have paid more attention to the demand side of voluntary carbon offsets, and we wanted to take a step back. We wanted to look at the supply and how it is framed. So we were interested on understanding the extent and nature of airlines' carbon offsetting communication in their websites. And we were interested in studying if voluntary carbon offsetting messages convey information that allow consumers to actually make concise and recognize what carbon offsetting is and make informed decisions. So to do that, we first built a typology of misleading and trustworthy claims. And indeed, traditional research in greenwashing has focused only on identifying if companies greenwash and in which ways. This captures only part of the message that as consumers we face when purchasing products. What is more likely is that we face a mix of reliable information with more or less some misleading claims here and there between the lines. So whenever we want, as an organization, communicate our environmental credentials, we can do it in a variety of ways, and we develop a typology based on existing literature. As organizations, we may have two choices. One, on what we want to communicate, and then a second choice on how we want to communicate it. Orange here indicates misleading, and blue indicates trustworthy types of claims. And we adapted work from previous scholars and the 7 signs of greenwashing, and then mapped it against the literature of carbon offsetting. So that created a matrix of 4x7 matrix for misleading and trustworthy claims, which gives a total of 56 potential different combinations of messages on what and how to communicate environmental claims as an organization. So companies, for example, may communicate a specific product attributes, operational processes, factual information, or image-evoking claims, and they may do so by being misleading or trustworthy in 7 different ways. So they may be fibbing or giving a honest claim. They may use false or verifiable third-party eco-labels, or being vague or instead being concrete with their claims. To put an example, here, what this typology would look like in the context of voluntary carbon offsetting. So product-specific claims can be fibbing when misrepresenting the scientific realities of flying or offsetting, or reliable when claims accurately represent the reality of flying and offsetting. Product-specific claims can also be misleading by making comparison claims that distract the consumers from greater environmental impacts, such as implying that voluntary carbon offsetting is the best option, or can be trustworthy by making comparable claims. For example, acknowledging other means the airlines can use to reduce emissions, or such as technology or SAF, or alternatives to flying when short-haul flights. And to put an example on the processes and type of operational processes claims, those can be vague by not explaining how something will be done or not providing details, in this case of carbon offsetting processes and mechanisms to calculate emissions, and, for example, using jargon and complex terminology. But alternative operational process claims can be about what offsetting means, and the whole process of offsetting can be explained comprehensively, clearly, and with simple language that actually reaches consumers. So having identified these 56 potential types of claims, then how did we test this typology? So we used a sample of airlines operating in 2016 based on a prior study, and from 116 airlines operating both in 2016 and 2020, 41 airlines offered carbon offsets, but only 37 offered voluntary carbon offsettings in their website or through an external website owned by the same company. So we focused our analysis on these 37 airlines. Worth noting is that our results are based on 2020 data, and airlines communication may have improved or changed or decreased its quality since then. But what we did is we followed a 4-step analysis. First, we analyzed case by case through manual content analysis. We categorized the claims, more than 1,500 claims, into these 56 types of claims. Our unit of analysis was claims, not sentences, as one sentence can have multiple claims, as we will see later on. Then we ran linear regression analysis to understand how specific variables affect the quality of messages. So variables were related to the airlines themselves. And then we aimed to answer the question of what is the likelihood of airlines adopting one type or nature of claim, that is what to communicate and how to communicate it, over other options. So in here, we considered each claim as a discrete choice with the assumption of independence of irrelevant alternatives. So that means, for example, that the odds of preferring one claim over the other do not depend on the presence or absence of other claims. In practice, that means that the relative probabilities of misleading in product or image do not change if we introduce the option of misleading on process, for example. And that allows us to perform multinomial logic regressions with fixed effects when considering this type of claims. And finally, to corroborate the typology, we aim to identify how wording differs and supports misleading and truthworthy messages. And we used lexical analysis through Leximancer software. For all the statistical details, please refer to the article. Here I will provide an overview of the results, but without the statistical tables. First, what are the changes between 2016 and 2020? What are the trends? Well, the adoption of voluntary carbon offsetting programs among airlines has relatively stagnated, with a very modest increase of airlines having new programs. But the communication has improved since 2016. Airlines rely on certification and third-party calculators to increase credibility more than internal calculation methods, and they are also more transparent in the calculation methods. There has also been an increase in airlines offering voluntary carbon offsets before the ticket purchase. And in terms of the programs that they offer, or the options of projects that they offer, the majority continue to be energy projects, but forestry protection and reforestation are increasing its popularity in terms of choices that airlines make. And then the majority of projects are located in Asia, Africa, and Pacific. But in general, there is a positive trend when we look at carbon offsetting between 2016 and 2020. When we look at the specific communication patterns, what we found is that the majority of airlines' voluntary carbon offsetting communication online is truthworthy, 56%, but greenwashing remains overly present in consumers' online experience, right, with 44% of misleading claims. Here on the left, we visualize the percentage of misleading or truthworthy voluntary carbon claims in the total number of sentences per airline. So airlines, as we can see here, vary in their degree of misleading from a small percentage, 20%, to a large percentage, 100%. For example, here on the left-hand side, on the top, we can see airlines that have 100% misleading. And that means that they would mislead in each of the sentences. And a 30% truthworthy would indicate that that airline provides reliable claims in nearly 1/3 of the sentences. For example, we have here Jetstar with a 71%. That means that this has misleading claims in 3/4 of all sentences. Or Qantas, for example, has a 52% truthworthy claims. That means half of the claims are truthworthy. Or Air New Zealand presents a 78% of sentences with truthworthy claims. That means 3/4 are truthworthy and 1/4 of misleading claims. So what is clear is that consumers receive a mix of misleading and truthworthy information when making these choices to offset or not their flight emissions, and that actually varies widely depending on the airline you are purchasing the flight ticket. In terms of what they communicate, we can see that there are differences about misleading claims, mostly on product and image, as half of those were misleading. And then product and image claims are less easily verifiable and rely on broad themes as community, sustainable, or planet. And instead, airlines provide more reliable messages on process and factual claims, which are much more easily verifiable, such as certification and which types of certifications they use. If we look at how airlines communicate voluntary carbon offsetting, that is the 7 signs of greenwashing, here we see the percentage of claims of each of the different types of claim of signs out of the total percentage of claims. Most of the airlines mislead most often through vague claims, for example, on the product, without further explaining what offset means or how it works. Lesser of two evils here is in this context refers to omitting carbon offsetting limitations and implying that voluntary carbon offsetting is the best alternative. So for explaining until there are no carbon neutral flights, that's the best you can do. And also no proof has a 7%. So no proof was also common, for example, for claims on being the greenest, offsetting employees' travel, investing in projects of the highest quality, but all those claims without substantiating them with any evidence. And then when we look at the truthworthy claims, we see that most of the truthworthy claims here seen in a percentage as blue, they are relevant claims, providing additional useful information to consumers to make informed decisions, such as on the types of projects and how each of those worked, or on the methodology to calculate carbon emissions, and relying on third parties to calculate that rather than internally. It is also worth noting, if you see here, that the related claims to labels on offsets were considered truthworthy in nearly all the cases, because they refer to these third-party well-recognized standards. And those include gold standard, verified carbon standard, or also using programs accredited under the national governments, such as, for example, the Australian government's national carbon offset standard. And therefore, because there were third parties, we considered them, in this case, at that point in time, as truthworthy. And we looked as well as the wording and whether the wording reinforces certain messages in misleading or reliable messages. And what we found is actually that there are differences in the lexical choices and the concept that those words carry between misleading and truthworthy claims. So, for example, misleading claims include more words as reduce, flight, tree, and travel, and refer to concepts such as planet, community, neutral, compliance, and protecting. And when we looked at the truthworthy claims instead, they use much more often CO2, emissions, calculator, information, fuel, climate, and those words carry concepts such as effect, measure, process, negative, or verified. So this difference in wording and the concepts that those words carry can frame voluntary carbon offsetting and flying in a more scientifically accurate way, or instead they can oversell its benefits while greening the idea of flying and the airlines. We expected also that companies have different ways of communicating misleading and truthworthy claims. So we decided to cluster airlines into their level of misleading and separately their level of truthworthiness into high, middle, and low clusters to assess if they have different communication patterns. And here we see the clusters for truthworthy claims. And basically what we found is that some of the least misleading airlines are among the highest truthworthy airlines, and vice versa. Some of the highest misleading are among the lowest truthworthy, but not all. So there is no 100% evidence of one-to-one relationship. That means that some airlines mislead more than competitors, but also they provide more reliable information than competitors. So what is important here is that each cluster of airlines have different patterns of communicating misleading and truthworthy information on what they communicated and how they communicated. So let's see an example. Here we can see a comparison through the multinomial logic that we performed about how high and middle misleading airlines are more likely to mislead in the product and image than the process claims when compared to the low misleading. Tactics for deceiving consumers also differ, with high misleading companies being more likely to engage in fibbing and vagueness, while, for example, middle misleading companies use less no proof. And instead, when we looked at the high truthworthy are more likely to provide reliable messages on their processes and image and communicate in less vague and manner. We also performed a multinomial logic regression to identify the likelihood of choosing each type of claim with every nature of claim, so what and how to communicate the messages. And what we found is that misleading in product increases the odds of choosing the tactics to mislead through fibbing, vagueness, and lesser of two evils, so unfair comparisons. And airlines, when misleading in the process, are more likely to deceive consumers through unfair comparisons, so lesser of two evils. And then for the image, instead, airlines are more likely to use hidden trade-offs, no proof, or irrelevant claims. And when we looked at the truthworthy, airlines are more likely to be truthworthy in product by providing relevant information. They are more likely to be truthworthy in operational processes of carbon offsetting by providing more reliable information, and also by explaining and informing consumers about the positive and negative aspects of voluntary carbon offsetting. And instead, for image, they are more likely to provide verifiable labels, as we saw before. But to complicate matters a bit more, sentences, what we found is that they can be misleading for different claims, and a sentence can also be misleading and trustworthy for different claims. So let's do a couple of examples. Here, the airline explains the voluntary purchased and retired more than 12 million carbon offsets without providing any proof, and then continues saying that achieving carbon neutral growth since 2012, which we considered was fitting because it didn't provide any proof. In the following sentence, passengers may select to donate an equal or optional amount in support of climate care, international carbon reduction projects, and complete the zero carbon travel. So the first sentence, the first claim, we consider this lesser of two evils in that it implies donation of offsets is better than not donating. And then the second part was considered fitting because if you donate an optional amount, that does qualify for zero carbon flights. And then if we look at the other complication is that sentences can be both misleading and trustworthy for different reasons and different claims. We can see here also two examples. So first airline, that airline made a significant investment in new aircraft models and the latest engine technology, making it one of the greenest airlines in the region. So we considered the first part of the sentences was considered trustworthy, as in the same page of the website, there was more detail provided as to what type of technology and progress the airline was investing in. But then the second claim, being one of the greenest, was considered a no-proof claim, which happened often in claims saying being the first, being the best, being the greenest, without providing any evidence. Actually, a lot of airlines were saying we are the best, we are the first, but there was no evidence to that. And then the last example we see here is another airline that disclosed the calculation of the footprint, saying that it is not entirely accurate, that it is an approximation. Thus, we consider that it's a hidden trade-off, but actually provides a honest answer to that trade-off, while the second claim in orange was considered vague about the project being supported because they did not provide any detail about those projects. But overall, what we see is that different patterns and a mix of misleading and trustworthy information, and we feel that these may complicate our ability as consumers to judge the issue fairly. Also, we tested some airline factors and how those may affect the choices we make as airlines make for communication. First, airlines providing information before the ticket purchase tended to be more trustworthy, which supports prior research saying that reliable information is more effective in creating customers' purchase intentions of voluntary carbon offsets. And then text length had an effect on what was communicated and how it was communicated. So for example, airlines with longer text were more likely to mislead in their image claims, while airlines with shorter text were more likely to mislead with product claims and other different patterns. Then third-party verification of offsets that we saw airlines were using credible offsetting programs. We didn't see instead that it has no impact to improve communication quality. So that means that while certification signals credibility and increases consumers' willingness to pay, those airlines still engage in dubious marketing or claiming messages on their websites in other aspects non-related to the labels they use. Experience in voluntary carbon offsetting also matters, as late adopters, airlines that were those engaged in voluntary carbon offsetting after 2016 tended to be more misleading because they display lengthy text with low reading ease. And actually, we found several airlines that mislead 3 times more than provide trustworthy claims. They use jargon without explanation, irrelevant information, and claims that basically distract consumers from the greater environmental impacts of flying. And finally, we also identified that misleading communication also depends on where you are located as an airline, with airlines in different, in developed countries and developing countries differ in their communication patterns. And what we found is that airlines from developed countries are likely to mislead more often in the product and image and use irrelevant claims. Finally, we also looked at the framings that those different claims, misleading and truthworthy claims, put on the programs of voluntary carbon offsetting in airlines. We find first, carbon offsetting is provided as a solution, inviting consumers to be an active part of the airline solution to climate change. Then carbon offsets is seen as an effective answer to achieving sustainable aviation. And here explicitly saying it is the best way. And then third, it's a framing of being simple, cheap, easy solution for climate change. We actually see here one of the quotes. And in 2023, another airline uses exactly the same sentence about being as cheap as a cup of coffee. And then fourth, it's about bringing co-benefits. So how voluntary carbon offsets are framed in a way that they bring benefits to the environment, benefits to the society, and to the customer, for example, through tax reductions in this case. And indeed, the research has found that providing co-benefits can actually increase consumers' willingness to offset. But basically, these framings contribute to limit the subject, scope, and boundaries of the controversy of flying. The combined misleading and truthworthy claims on different product attributes, processes, facts, and image with different framings. We believe it enhances the airline's green image and exploits consumers' moral concern for air travel. So we may consider, or we may ask ourselves, how much has changed since we did this study, because the websites were from 2020. Well, actually, airlines are still making the news on greenwashing for their advertisements, launch of green responsible flying programs, and also their offsetting options. And the latest case, for example, is Delta for their pledge on the world's first carbon neutral airline statement, which is facing now a lawsuit in California. So they are still part of the media attention for their greenwashing claims. And also, similar to what we found in 2020, almost all airlines still name their carbon offsetting program as Fly Carbon Neutral. And this is likely to face more of a scrutiny, especially in the European Union, as the 11th May, the European Parliament voted to ban claims of carbon neutrality that are based on offsetting alone. And finally, a quick review on the internet also revealed a mix of misleading and truthworthy claims across the airlines, some of which provide a lot of information with what offsets are and how they work in the purchase moment, while others offer very limited information. But we saw a mix of types of misleading claims and truthworthy claims with similar framings that we can see here from 2020. So, moving forward, what can we do? Well, actually, this year, 2023, misleading environmental claims are under the microscope, and there has been more and more governments paying attention to the greenwashing. In the European Union, a proposal of the new directive, the Green Claim Directive on Substantiation and Communication of Explicit Environmental Claims, is now under study. And it aims to ensure reliability, comparability, verifiability of environmental claims, and setting a minimum criteria for those claims, and also a minimum transparency and credibility for sustainability labels. In Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission is investigating issues relative to the previous study of the previous year that identified half of the companies that screened have dubious claims in the internet, and is therefore undertaking enforcement and compliance, particularly to infringements in the customer protection law. That may lead to administrative resolutions, infringement notices, or even legal proceedings. It intends to develop sector-specific guidance and encourage reporting of any potential misleading claims by the society and other companies. And the Senate has also now opened an inquiry into greenwashing. So misleading environmental claims are really a focus of attention worldwide across governments. And given this context, well, what companies can do to appeal to consumers' environmental concern without the risk of being accused of greenwashing? So the first of all, it's staying clear right away of broad brush statements as carbon neutral flying, for example. So rather than saying we are the greenest, our program was the first and the best, and implying guilt-free flying, it is about reliable, comparable, verifiable environmental claims to back up those broad statements. And there are multiple ways in which companies can do that. Here we see 8 ideas. So first of all, providing relevant information, reliable and accurate information, demonstrating scientific evidence to back up those claims, provide concrete rather than generic statements, use simple language and no jargon, substantiate comparative claims, provide a honest, balanced view of the benefits and potential environmental negative effects of the choices, and also use credible and verifiable labels. So how that would look like in practice. So if we look at specific examples using the most likely misleading choices airlines make, and based on real examples from websites from other airlines that were trustworthy, we will see a couple of examples here. So how can we transform a vague claim to a concrete claim? Well, here we see the airline goes into detail. First, we don't see it, but the airline went into detail of why carbon offsetting is transacted in carbon or CO2 equivalent. And that includes different greenhouse gas emissions that have different global warming potentials, then explains all the process in a scientific and accurate manner. But then at the end of the section finishes with what is meant in simple terms and in a way that it is still scientifically accurate and can reach the wider population. When making comparisons with lesser of two evils, rather than implying that voluntary carbon offsetting is the best option to mitigate CO2 emissions, airlines may disclose measures taken to reduce emissions, such as the new, more fuel-efficient aircrafts, or disclose alternatives to air travel in short distances, such as the example we see here of the airline doing that even before the European countries proposed a ban on short-haul flights. That airline was proposing or informing consumers that there are other travel options, especially for short-term distances, as the railway, that are much more efficient, less carbon intensive, but also more efficient in terms of time for consumers. And then how can organizations provide an evidence claim that can be easy, as in this case, not only saying that you contribute to a sustainable certification, certified CO2 reduction project, but also providing a link to which certification it is and providing the link to the third party, so such that consumers can verify that. And then the latest example is on hidden trade-offs. For example, the airline acknowledges flying emits greenhouse gas emissions, and those have a significant negative effect in the planet by contributing to climate change. Or the other airline that explains how it does not include the impact of radioactive forcing in its calculation, and then goes on saying that they adopt the position of X government on X paper and research. So overall, as consumers, we constantly face greenwashing in our purchase experiences online. At least that's what we find with carbon offsetting. And our research, we find that we face these complex messages, reliable in some aspects and misleading in others, misleading in soft ways that are less easily verifiable, with sentences that can be misleading and reliable in different ways, sentences that can mislead in multiple ways, framings that in the context of offsetting your flight tickets support airlines' green image and also tap to the consumer's concern that we may have as for air travel. But what it's critical to remember is that we need to understand the communication choices, both for misleading and trustworthy, to be able then to develop regulatory measures that tackle the issue, are comprehensive enough to actually lead to the meaningful changes we need to see for more reliable consumption choices. And for companies, not only because research has identified greenwashing may induce the confusion, low trust and skepticism, but also because of this increased pressure or regulatory pressure, it's now more important than ever, right, to start understanding how we can communicate our sustainable attributes and green attributes in a reliable way. And basically, we propose this typology on the type and nature of claim, what and how to communicate, that can serve as a blueprint for organizations to turn their misleading communication into reliable and trustworthy messages. That's all from my part, and I'm glad that we now have time for an open discussion and Q&As.
Thank you so much for that, Mireia. That was such a fascinating presentation and so topical.